for the Texas State Soil Water Conservation Board. Tina's the program manager for Texas, so she works with both Texas Soil Board and TCEQ. Leslie Rauscher is a project officer for TCEQ. She's ill today, so she's not available. What we thought we'd do was kind of go over this past year. We had kind of a huge fire drill all year. But we had GAO kind of doing an audit on us, and then EPA headquarters was doing their own study and kind of sending recommendations up to Washington. And so this is kind of the outline of our presentation today. It's going to be pretty short. I took a look at Aaron's presentation. He's kind of going to go into some of this stuff a little bit more than we are. So the National Audit Study of the NPS program. As I said, the GAO, Congress requested a national audit of the program to assess the effectiveness. And that report is coming kind of any day now. They've been promising it for a while, and I actually think it's pretty close to getting into our hands. So once we get that, we'll update y'all. As I also said, EPA headquarters conducted a self-evaluation. They sent out a bunch of questionnaires to the states, and I believe some of the cooperators here received that as well. We're going to go over some of, I guess, the recommendations that were sent up to OMB here in the next couple of slides. And that final bullet there, it's just to drive the point that we're having massive cuts kind of across the board everywhere. And this is going to equate to roughly about 20% cut, and that's about $1 million less for each agency. So some changes that we're thinking are going to happen to the program. For program improvements, these also will be in the next couple of slides. We'll kind of go into these a little bit more. Increase fiscal and programmatic accountability. Increase the rigor of annual satisfactory progress determination. More detailed and thorough work scopes and annual reports. This is kind of going to create a headache for some of y'all. We're going to start asking for more information on some of these work scopes to kind of get a better idea of costs and actual deliverables and things along those lines. And the last thing here, improve fiscal management. And by that, we're kind of getting at, getting to more proactively manage finances. In order to increase drawdown rates, increasing leveraging, in order to make the program more effective and more efficient. We're also being pressed to really show results and success stories, and that's kind of the number one thing we hear from Washington, is where are these success stories for the amount of money coming in. And as it says up here, we only have 1% of NPS impaired water bodies restored nationwide. The last bullet here, leaner budget, is expected to focus on results-oriented, targeted priorities. We're getting cut across the board. And just with the scale here in Texas, it just drives the point we need to be more creative, to be more efficient and more effective in terms of the type of work that we are doing in order so we can get actual water quality improvements. So as far as improving fiscal accountability, 3 things that we wanted to kind of bring up today is May 31st is the deadline to actually have work plans negotiated. I believe a month later is when the grant application actually has to be in, but as far as work scopes are concerned, that's between Soil Board, or between the state and us. That's when we actually have to have everything hammered out. So do your best when you're working with the state, when y'all are going back and forth, try to communicate with them. If y'all have questions, we're here as a resource as well and can help kind of guide y'all, and we'll work with the state to just to provide some suggestions. Our region, well, I guess the program as well, we've been eyeballed a lot because we have a lot of money kind of just sitting there. We've been kind of asked to, speed up the drawdown rate. So we are looking at grants that are 3 years or older and looking at the money that is sitting there. So when you see a project kind of getting to the 2.5-year mark or the 3-year mark, that's when we're going to start asking questions about what's going good and hopefully applying some of that adaptive management and maybe shuffling money around just so it's not sitting there and we're not getting asked, like, why is that money sitting there? Another possible way to help out with finances, maybe scale down some of these scopes of these projects. Just like Commissioner Clary was saying, some of the landowners aren't willing to implement some of these BMPs. So maybe one scenario would be to kind of phase out the projects where we're not having a potload of money kind of just sitting there waiting for people to buy in. But maybe split that project up into like 2 phases that could go over 6 years, and hopefully that money would kind of be drawn down, I guess, in a more acceptable manner for us. Tina?
Good afternoon. Everybody stay awake since we're just not too far after lunch. Can y'all hear me if I don't stand behind that thing? No? Okay. All right. Darn.
Recording this so we can use this against you.
Oh, no. I'm done now. Henry mentioned that I'm the program manager for Texas, and I'm not sure, for this audience, I'm not sure who knows or who understands the difference between a project officer and a program manager. Basically, project officers are those who deal with the money side of things, the grant side. Henry and Leslie take care of that. Fortunately, I don't have to deal with much of anything that has a dollar sign in front of it. I get to deal with the more technical issues, project and program. So I have large-scale things like the program, and then small-scale things on a project-level basis. I can provide technical assistance on things like that. I want to back up just a little bit. This first bullet here on program accountability refers to satisfactory progress. And for those who may not be as intimately familiar with the terminology of the program, the national program, satisfactory progress is a term designated. It's a hoop that the state has to jump through to make sure that they're eligible for the next grant money. So if EPA determines that they are making satisfactory progress in implementing their statewide management plan, then they can get the next grant. If EPA were to determine that they're not making satisfactory progress, then they would be ineligible for the next grant. So when you see the term satisfactory progress, it does not directly apply per se to project level work. So don't be confused or concerned when you see satisfactory progress in the context of a project. Given that headquarters is still headquarters, and OMB and all those other agencies are coming up with recommendations for the program and how they want the new guidance to look, how they want EPA to administer the program, we're kind of in a limbo here. We've got some draft recommendations that EPA has done on their self-audit that they've provided to these other agencies. It's kind of a proactive measure, kind of like suggesting your punishment before you actually get your punishment. It's kind of that approach. So we don't have anything that directly says what our evaluation criteria will be for 2013. All we have are some in-house things that have been passed around and are still up in the air. But headquarters has said that they will, in this fiscal year, have us some definitive guidelines that we can use to determine satisfactory progress for the states that we will use in 2013. So for this cycle, we're not going to be using that. And kudos to Texas, because they just turned in their annual report for the management plan, and which I think is, somebody said, is the earliest the state's ever done that. So great job for the state. So we'll be reviewing that. We'll determine whether the state has made satisfactory progress, and so that's the way that whole process works. When the definitive guidelines do come down from headquarters, there is talk, and like I said, this again is kind of a draft recommendation, and it's not written in stone or given to us as guidelines yet. But the expectation is that existing watershed plans that are coming up for an update after these guidelines are released will have to adhere to whatever those guidelines say. Nobody's really expecting any major significant changes in these guidelines. Fortunately, Texas has been a little bit more diligent and proactive than some of the other states. So there are a lot of other states out there that have a lot more catch up to do to get up to the job that Texas is already doing. Some of the milestones that we'll be looking at, and Henry alluded to some of these, will be milestones at the management plan level, which the draft management plan that you'll hear more about in Aaron's presentation does have milestones in it. So those will be evaluated every 5 years when the management plan comes up for review, and there will be annual milestones in there that are looked at every year as part of the satisfactory progress determination. We want to see watershed-based plans with milestones in there. I think everybody's already got that on their radar. You're already doing that. Plum Creek's got some good ones. Granbury's got some good ones. There are other good ones out there. So that's not going to be a problem. And the use of milestones, development of milestones as part of project work scopes, that's something to keep on your radar screen too. Oops. There we go. And also, like Henry mentioned, the program is being scrutinized more and more for water quality results. What's the bang for all these bucks that they've been putting in the pipeline in 319? And that's, that's kind of a state-by-state basis on how they strategize, what projects they elect to put on the ground. It takes time. It just takes time to turn around water quality problems that maybe have been degrading for years, decades, centuries in some places. So we want to keep our eye on ways to generate more water quality improvements and more success stories. And success stories, or WQ10, is a parameter by which EPA, the region, is measured on the scale of headquarters. So nationally, each region has a certain number of success stories they commit to every year, and the region has, I don't know, the region has, I think, 2 per state, 1 per state, 2 per state, something like that. And if we meet those targets or exceed those targets, that's great. If you don't meet those targets, then you get 10 slashes with a wet noodle or something. I mean, there are consequences for that. And I think that's it. There's our contacts. Like I said, Leslie's not here today, but you can reach any of us at these phone numbers, email. We have a pretty good phone tree system, so if you don't get us, we're pretty diligent about answering our email voicemails. Thank you.
We have copies of that PowerPoint also available?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
We'll save questions for once we get all the panelists up here. Okay. And as we were going around and gathering up all of the, yes?
Missing one sticker.
Oh, we're missing one clicker.
All right, you caught me.
Well, Aaron, if you want to come up here and kind of talk, I guess, a little bit from the state perspective.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Tina and Henry, for y'all's presentation. I think both of these presentations, the intent here is to get all of y'all thinking so that when we have this panel discussion, we can give y'all some good answers and y'all can ask us some good questions. I'm going to touch on 3 things. I'm going to touch on the report to OMB that Henry mentioned, and just a comment or 2 about the GAO report that's very similar in concept, and then I'm going to talk about some specifics in Texas, some things that we're changing, and how we're moving forward. The first item is this OMB report. EPA, as Henry and Tina said, this report was a self-generated report. EPA did this report internally and turned it into OMB, which is the Office of Management and Budget, which reports to the President. They are the group that heavily influences budget decisions and program accountability for the executive office, executive branch. This report was recently completed in November. It's a couple hundred pages, and it was a national program evaluation. I think that EPA knew that this GAO study was happening, and so part of the concept here, I think, was that EPA wanted to get ahead of some of the things that GAO might find out or comment on, and so EPA did this internal study to help the states and EPA better be able to defend the program, the successes we've had ourselves, and the challenges we've self-identified. Who knows how this report is going to be implemented? EPA can make changes to the program, President can make changes to the program, Congress can take it and run with it. GAO could cite this OMB study that EPA did themselves. It's available on the website, on EPA's website. I encourage you to read the whole thing. It really talks about some really good positives in other states that we could adopt here in Texas, as well as some challenges that other states are having that I don't think we're having those same challenges. It covers a whole variety of topics. It talks about the 319 funding and how that money is broken down. EPA really asked questions about our agency, TCQ and TSSWCB, and our FTEs that we have allocated to manage the grants and the program statewide. There's a section that talks about regulatory authority. Some states have more regulatory permitting power over non-point source than Texas does. There's a significant discussion about leveraging funds. Henry talked about the cuts to the funding, an 18 to 20% cut over, since FY10. So over 3 federal fiscal years, we've dropped a fifth of the money. And so how can we leverage other funds, other federal funds, other state funds, other NGO type funds? The report talks about a need for an increase in coordination with other federal agencies on non-point source management. I think for Texas, the discussion about USDA is the most relevant. There's also a discussion in there about Clean Water State Revolving Fund. This is the loan program that the Clean Water Act established that in Texas is managed by Texas Water Development Board. I think we've had a presentation or two on that at previous roundtables. Another thing that this report gets into is how does the state select projects? How do we prioritize those, and how do we select them and move forward? And finally, there's some discussion on non-point source TMDLs and watershed plans and environmental results, like Tina was talking about success stories and how we're tracking the non-point source components of the TMDLs and these watershed plans. A couple of the overall themes, again, I'm repeating what Henry and Tina did here, but I think it's important. There's a discussion of accelerating environmental improvements and water quality restoration. This discussion about accountability of the funds and spending money on time, achieving goals and objectives and agreed scopes of work, and reporting that progress has been critical. We already talked about leveraging. Henry touched on some of these as well, these recommendations or potential changes that flow out of this report. It's unclear on how some of these will be implemented, if some of them will be implemented, but this is what the report tends to suggest. This discussion of satisfactory progress, like Tina was discussing, this is primarily an EPA and state discussion on satisfactory progress, but it fundamentally comes down to all of y'all. It comes down to individual 319 projects. It comes down to individual actions in watersheds and our ability to show progress towards restoration, to show effective use of the money, efficient use of the money. This satisfactory progress provision has been used since the beginning of the program, but it's not been as structured, as stringent maybe as it's going to be in the next couple of years. The report observes that several of the states have non-point source management programs that are very old and whatnot. We're already working on that. I'll talk about that in a minute. An important bullet here that flows out of the report is this money. Money that, 319 money that isn't used in a quick enough time period, whatever that time period is defined as, or money that, like Henry mentioned, he mentioned a May 31st deadline to everybody, and that if the state and EPA don't have agreement on scopes of work and budgets for our allocation that year, then there's some money that we might not get. And so there's this discussion about the region, which in this case would be the 5 states, Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, and New Mexico, competing for that money. So money that belongs to the people of Texas by formula could be taken away from us and competed to the other states in this competition if we as the state, if we as our cooperating entities can't demonstrate efficient and effective use of the money and agree to new scopes of work on time with EPA. So there's a risk of us losing money. And Henry already told you that there's a 5th cut that happened over the last 2 years. This discussion about SRF is a big topic, and it's one that some states have been very successful in using. These loan programs, both the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and the Clean Water State Revolving Fund are loan programs, low-interest loan programs that have historically primarily been used for wastewater treatment plant upgrades or drinking water treatment upgrades at those systems, but non-point source style projects are eligible for these funds. And some states have been very successful with that, and we've been working with Water Development Board already in Texas to make better use of that in Texas. Then, of course, discussion about USDA and agricultural non-point source and how we can better increase that involvement statewide. Again, in Texas, I think we have a fairly good success with that compared to other states. Moving on to the other report that Henry said is not yet out. It was supposed to be done sometime this month. That was the original plan. It's GAO's report, which is the Government Accountability Office, and it reports to Congress. And so we've got an executive branch study that was done for OMB, and now we have a legislative branch study that's being done. It was specifically requested by a committee, and we'll see what the committee does with that afterwards. It had similar objectives, to look at how the states are implementing their programs, how EPA oversees the money in the program, and ways to improve the program. This is an important slide here, I think, because the GAO did 2 things. One, they came to us, they came to the state agencies, and they asked us some pretty pointed, hard questions on our money, on who it goes to. How much of our grant that we get from EPA each year goes out, passed through to agencies and groups like y'all? How many FTEs do we use to manage that program? They also wanted to know how many FTEs, how many employees our 319 money is paying for at all of our cooperating entities. And then, of course, they wanted to know, again, the same question that EPA asked for the other study: how did we select projects? What was our decisions to rank and prioritize projects? One of the other things that GAO did that we had some discussion with them over was they contacted all of y'all directly. Our sub-grantees, the people that we pass the money through to do the work on the ground, they contacted y'all directly. I'd like to know in here how many of y'all received an email or a phone call from GAO to do a web-based survey from a project, a historical project or a current project. At least one person, 2? Okay, good. And hopefully y'all responded and gave GAO some answers. They didn't send them to everybody. They only sampled a couple hundred projects across the nation, closed projects. They weren't really focused on open projects is what they told us. But they didn't tell us. They didn't tell the state who they contacted, which projects they contacted, or the people they contacted. So we'll just have to see what the results of the study are. Moving on to Texas, our non-point source management program. This is our comprehensive strategy for guiding everything we do, making decisions on non-point source. Ultimately, it falls to the State Board and TCEQ, and we have to have this program approved by EPA to continue receiving the money. So regardless of monies that get cut, or if per chance we could get an increase in 319 money, we can't get any of it unless we have this program approved by EPA. We last did this in December '05, so we're well over 5 years. But we are in the process of updating this now. I put our website up there. There's also a link to TCEQ, a similar page on their website that talks about this revision. This is an important thing because this document is going to be used in a whole variety of contexts. It's going to be used be used by EPA, like Tina was talking about, the satisfactory progress, the milestones and objectives and goals that we lay out as a state in this program, in this document. That's what they're going to use to judge us and judge our progress. It's going to be used by State Board and TCEQ to make decisions on 319 projects, on funding, where our money is going to go each year. This is an important document. These are some key content, some key chapters that I would like y'all to look at as affected stakeholders, affected people, and entities. Chapter 1 talks about the 9 components. How many of y'all have filled out one of the 319 grant scopes of work for TCEQ or the State Board? You know that question that asks you to reference the components and the long and short-term goals. This is what we mean, so this is an opportunity to guide and steer those goals over the next 5 years. Chapter 2 talks about the specific long and short-term goals. Chapter 3 is something totally new, watershed action planning. I've got another slide or two on that. I'll talk about that more in a minute. Chapter 5, hopefully most of your agencies and entities have been contacted separately over the last 18 months, but that chapter talks about each individual agency and each of your programs that you have that address and deal with non-point source from some variety, some perspective. Appendix C is totally new, and it ties back to watershed action planning. I'll talk about that in a minute. Appendix E is also totally new, and this is the table of milestones for the program. These are commitments that the state is making to EPA. This is the primary table, primary line items that I think EPA will probably use in satisfactory progress. They'll look at other things like our money and expenditure rates, and like Henry was talking about, how much money we don't have spent in a timely fashion. But these milestones for the statewide program in Appendix E are going to be very important. So if you're going to read anything, this document is, what is it, Arthur? It's 300 pages total?
It's this big.
There you go. So if you're going to read any of it, read this bit right here, please. Just an observation on the timeline. Last week, the State Board did give staff authorization to move forward and publish in the Texas Register and put it out there for official public comment. This morning, TCEQ staff received the same authority from their commission, so you should all expect to see the official notice in the Register come soon and public comment for about a 30-day period. We're going to have a public meeting like we always do for these types of things in Austin. Those of you who want to make comment can submit written comment or show up at that meeting. But in May is when we're going to hopefully take it back to the State Board and the Commission for adoption. Based on whatever public comment is, we'll revise it and move forward there, and then ultimately it goes to the governor, and the governor's got to turn it into EPA. And that's got to happen June, July timeframe, so EPA can review it and keep to our timelines. All right, what I was saying earlier about watershed action planning. How many have heard of that acronym, heard of this new thing in any little bit before today? A few, maybe half. This is a new process that the state has been working on for two and a half years to roll out, develop. It's a new process for coordinating and tracking all of our water quality management programs, not just non-point source, but permitting programs, things that affect impaired water quality like Superfund or other water quality programs like TCEQ permitting. It's primarily coordinated through TCEQ, the State Soil Board, and the Clean Rivers Program partners. and I'll get to in a minute here how this has significant implications for regional and local residents. Really, the bottom line is that this WAP process, this Watershed Action Planning process, was supposed to engage stakeholders in decision-making, increase the transparency on our agency's decisions on how do we solve these water quality problems. Are we going to do a TMDL? Are we going to do a watershed plan? Do we need to change the water quality standard? Those decisions haven't always been as transparent as some citizens and landowners would have liked, and this process was a response to that, to make it more so. And again, TCEQ has a website which has got all the details on it. Some of you may have seen this graphic before, but this kind of describes this watershed action planning process. It's conceptually designed as an annual process, and it kind of starts with the 303D list. Whatever the integrated report and 303D lists say are our water quality problems, that's where it starts, and it then flows through TCQ and state board staff and those Clean Rivers program partners to come up with some preliminary recommendations, and then we would go out public with that, and through the Clean Rivers program coordinated monitoring meetings. That's where other agencies and entities and the public that attend those meetings would have an opportunity to influence those decisions. And again, it's a cycle, and it would produce what's called a priority watershed report. So every year or every 2 years or however often this is done, a list of water bodies is created, and I guess that's the next slide. I'll get to that in a minute. So where are we on this new process? Well, it's I'll call it done for the first iteration. It's out there. Those Clean Rivers program partners and the state agencies have met throughout 2011 to talk about 1,200 water bodies. So if you look at the 2010 303D list, which was approved by EPA in November. All the impairments that are on there we discussed one by one, and then we added maybe 30 other water bodies that aren't impaired, not on the 303D list, but are of special interest to some entity. And all that gets put into this strategy table, the Watershed Action Planning Strategy Table. And that's where the transparency to the public is supposed to flow from. It describes and shows which strategy is the state moving forward with to resolve that water quality impairment. And the key point, I think, of all of this is that the non-point source management program, and I mentioned earlier in that other slide, Appendix C, so the water bodies that are a priority for non-point source, the water bodies that are a priority for 319 funding, are a subset of whatever watershed action planning decides. So the state will pull out those water bodies that are non-point source impaired from WAP and put them into the management program. And that's kind of what this is. The one on the left is that strategy table, the WAP strategy table, and the one on the right is the Appendix C out of the management program. And I forget, Arthur, how many did we pull out for the management program?
About 680, I think.
There you go. So a little over half of what was on the WAP table. And so we really want you to comment and look at both of them, because we want to make sure that we haven't inadvertently or incorrectly not moved something over. If there's a water body or an impairment on the WAP table that is important and non-point source related, but for some reason we didn't pull it over to Appendix C, we need to know that. So that's a comment we want you to look at. We want to make sure that you look at your water body of interest and those types of comments. As a result of the OMB study, the potential GAO study, the things that are changing with the management program that we were already initiating, Henry's alluded to some of these changes that are happening in our 319 program already. We've lost nearly 20% of the funds in roughly a 2-year period. Hopefully that doesn't continue in that downward trend. We were holding steady there for 3-4 years or so, but not right now. We have to do a better job of achieving restoration and reporting to EPA and ultimately to Congress our success stories, and that's going to get back to this WAP table. These priorities and targeted expenditure of 319 funds to achieve restoration. Henry already touched on how we're going to have to look hard at unliquidated obligations older than 3 years. So if you have a project that has a contract with us or TCQ and that money is older than 3 years and you haven't spent it yet, you better get nervous right now. And then we already touched on the other 3 bullets. That's all I have to help frame the panel discussion, to make it a lively panel discussion.
Arthur, would you like to add anything before we gather with all the panelists and start the questions? Or?
Really, I think Aaron did a great job of laying it all out.
All right. Well, Aaron and Arthur.